Hi, my name is Øyvind Eggen. I'm the Policy Director for Evaluation at the Norwegian Agency for Development. But I've also been a researcher focusing on the effects of aid, so I've read hundreds of studies on that topic. In this lecture, I will share with you what research and other evidence can tell us about whether aid works. But I'd like to start by lowering your expectations a bit. There are at least 3 reasons why we cannot give one conclusive answer on the question. One reason is that in spite of much research over decades, we simply do not have enough knowledge yet. A second reason is that, I previously noted, the question is not as straightforward as it might seem. For what does it mean that aid works? Does it mean that the interventions financed by aid are successful in transforming funds into results? Or does it mean that the results are relevant and useful for those expected to benefit? Does it mean that aid leads to long-term improvements, such as economic growth, more inclusive societies, or better government? Or does it mean generally that aid-receiving countries over time are better off than they would have been without aid? We have to specify what we mean by the question before trying to find an answer. Still, a third reason why it's difficult to answer is that aid is so diverse that it is not necessarily meaningful to find a general answer. Aid is provided to more than 100 countries and through all kinds of institutions, including the biggest World Bank mega projects and small village associations. It is provided in many different sectors and it aims at many different policy objectives. Some of those objectives can even be internally conflicting, so that success against one objective may be at the cost of other objectives. We may expect that aid sometimes works and sometimes not, and it may work according to certain objectives, but not according to other objectives. Anyway, let us see what evidence we can build on when trying to find an answer. First, we have the project and program reports from aid agencies. These are valuable because they have more in-depth knowledge of the project than any other written sources, and they are often quite detailed. From an academic point of view, they do not satisfy criteria for high-quality evidence, but researchers can still use them as a source of information. One of the challenges involved in project reports is that there is a tendency to overestimate results. But this has been checked, and you can see that external evaluations do not show very high discrepancy between project reported results and evaluations. So the problem of over-reporting is perhaps not as high as one might expect. A bigger challenge is what the project reports do not tell. There are at least 2 major limitations in these reports. One is that they only tell you whether improvements have happened in line with the project objectives. They do not tell us whether those improvements were because of aid. And they tell little about positive or negative effects that were not anticipated by those in charge. Another limitation is that most of them only report on achievements within the project period, since donors usually lose interest when the project ends. So they tell us very little about the long-term effects of projects. Then we have the evaluations of projects, normally done by independent or semi-independent experts. They are very useful in verifying whether project reports are reliable. And good evaluations can also tell us about causality, so that we know whether a project really made a difference. And they may give us more insight into the long-term effects beyond the scope of the project reports, or they may tell us about unintended side effects. Many evaluations are still limited to more or less the same information as are found in the project reports, or they are concerned about things other than the results of projects, such as whether the projects are well managed, or whether certain other policy interests are taken into account, like gender or human rights. These are very important questions, but it means that some of these evaluations don't tell us very much about whether aid works or not. We also have an increasing number of systematic studies of these evaluations or of project reports. Some are made by aid agencies and some by independent researchers. The best ones will take into account the quality of the evidence provided in each report, so that they will put more weight on the most robust evidence. And these studies are very useful to aggregate what evaluations or project reports really tell us, and I find them very valuable. But still, they cannot overcome the limitations from the reports they build on. And since we still don't have a sufficient number of really good, robust evaluations, the systematic studies of evaluations still do not tell us enough about to what degree aid works. But so far, I've talked about sources that in some way or the other are based on what the aid agencies themselves have produced or commissioned. Luckily, there are also truly independent studies that do not depend on information from the aid agencies. In general terms, they can be divided in two types. One is the independent research that takes specific projects or a selection of projects as their starting point. There are thousands of such studies carried out over decades. We have economic studies, we have anthropological studies, environmental studies, and so on. These studies are reliable since they are based on empirical research and recognized methodologies from social science. And they should be able to tell us a lot about whether aid works. But you may be a bit disappointed here. Most of them do not. In fact, most of them don't even try to find out whether projects are successful in terms of achieving their own objectives. Researchers may instead try to answer many other types of research questions, such as looking at adverse side effects, but ignoring the main objectives or impacts. They are also very diverse in terms of research questions, methodologies, or findings, so it's very difficult to aggregate the results into any general conclusion. But there is another group of academic studies that can be used to answer whether aid works. That would be the studies that can tell us about the aggregate effects of aid, regardless of each particular intervention. The most well-known are econometric studies that are based on statistical data on how much aid different countries have received and how they have developed in the period. The best ones use advanced statistical methods that can tell us not only about correlation, but also causality. There are also some other research that can reveal aggregate effects, such as effects of aid on national political developments or on local or international power relations. These are more qualitative studies, which provide valuable insight, but they are not as robust as the statistical studies, and they do not give the precise answers that policymakers often ask for. So they don't seem to have the same influence. So there are a diverse range of sources we have for evidence on whether aid works. What does all this evidence tell us? I told you that you won't get a conclusive answer, but nonetheless, available evidence seems to point to some general patterns. First, most projects seem to work, at least on short and medium term. All major reviews of project documents leave little doubt that throughout history, the majority of aid projects have achieved their immediate specific objectives, what aid agencies would call output or outcome level. The overall success rates of aid projects generally range from about 70 to 85%, with most donors now recording more than 75%. Success rates do, however, vary depending on donors, recipients, time periods, and type of interventions. So we see ranges from just below 50 to above 90% success. And we may have to deduct some for the tendency among donors to overstate their results, but there is no significant systematic discrepancy between the project reports and the many independent or semi-independent evaluations. This does not necessarily mean that those achievements were because of the project, and it does not tell us whether results were relevant or useful, or that the results represent value for money. But to some degree, at least they tell us that most projects can be regarded as a success according to their own stated goals. However, most donors will not be satisfied with short and medium-term success. They want to contribute to wider societal change. And project reports don't tell us very much about that. Second, we know very little about long-term effects of projects, simply because aid agencies do not report on what happens after they have left, and they rarely commission evaluations or other studies on what happens after a project ends. We all know, I guess, lots of anecdotes about projects having little or no long-term impact. It could be poorly maintained roads or empty factories a few years after project completion. It may be aid-financed welfare services that discontinue when funding ends. But I find it difficult to interpret such anecdotal stories and what they really tell us, mainly because failures may receive more attention than success, so there may be an issue of selection here. Unfortunately, social science cannot give us a general conclusion about the long-term effects of any single project either. With longer time horizons, it becomes increasingly difficult to distinguish cause and effect. And only a few studies have been done on that, but in most cases there are simply no methods available in social science to isolate the effects of aid from other factors that can influence on development. So I guess we have to accept that we will not get a definitive answer on that issue. But still, we can see a pattern in the available evidence. One pattern we see is that donors' expectations are very often unrealistic. Whether it's about infrastructure, factories, public service institutions, or civil society organizations, almost none of these develop as expected after the donors leave. Another pattern is that some types of projects stand out as particularly disappointed in terms of long-term effect. They would include most attempts to build institutional capacity, and attempts to reorganize poor people or to make them change their behaviors or attitudes, and attempts to influence on governance or policy processes. There are thousands of cases where Western experts have tried to change the way institutions work without seeing results. They have drafted laws and policies that are never implemented. They have organized the poor in groups that dissolve as soon as donors leave. This does not mean that such projects never succeed, but there is little doubt that the long-term effects expected by donors do not materialize. All that was about the individual projects. What about the aggregate effects of aid in the long term? While it is not easy to draw conclusion, in this case at least, social science has some methods available to study effects with some degree of precision. That would be econometric studies. The main limitation here is not our methodology, but availability of good data. We don't have enough data on developments over time. The data we have is mostly about economic development. So by far the best studied question in such studies is whether aid leads to economic growth. In spite of all the studies, this has not yet led to any definitive conclusion. Studies differ in the results, partly because they use different methods, or they have selected countries and time periods differently in their statistical analysis. Most of them do agree that the effect of aid on economic growth is very small, and many find that the effect also depends on recipient countries, institutions, and policies. But these studies should be seen in the light of what aid aims at. There is wide agreement among donors that growth alone is not the primary objective of aid, and it's not really a good measure of success. In fact, since the year 1990, only about a quarter of all Western aid has been of a nature that makes it reasonable to measure success in terms of growth. That would be infrastructure, business development, or such. So, in any case, the good news is that those studies that have tried to measure the effect of aid aiming at growth conclude positively. Some of those studies even conclude that such forms of aid have quite impressive rates of return that are comparable to domestic investments in Western countries. The rest of aid has aimed at other policy objectives, like poverty reduction, changes in governance, or policy changes. These may or may not have been achieved, but success in those areas cannot be directly translated into growth. There are some studies that try to find the effects of aid on such policy objectives, but they are fewer and they are not always as robust. The main reason is that we don't have enough data. Even the main goal for aid, namely poverty reduction, is not well supported with data before this millennium, since it was only with the Millennium Development Goals that we developed good data sets on that issue. In most countries, we simply do not know how many people who have been poor at different times in history. So researchers must be creative and use different types of indicators. For example, using under 5 mortality as an indicator for poverty or an indicator for health, when they try to assess the effects of aid on other policy objectives. What they find is generally positive. Studies that seek to measure the effects of aid on poverty are generally positive. The effects of aid on health and education shows more variation between the findings, but most of them are positive, but they point at what we call the fungibility of aid. That aid spending on health and education seem to correlate with less government spending on the same. So if that is the case, the effects of aid to health and education, at least in terms of spending, may be less than the aid spent, but the most studies still conclude in positive terms. The most disappointing part of this research literature are the studies that try to assess the effects of aid on social or political change or on institutional development. For example, on public institutions or state administration in general. Here, most available research, as well as most of aid agencies' own attempts to summarize results, come with negative conclusions. Not only does it say that aid in general has negative effects on state administration, several studies also find that even aid that aims at strengthening state institutions have little effect. In terms of other social and political effects of aid, it is even more difficult to find statistical evidence. Those studies that have tried generally conclude negatively. In these policy objectives, we may perhaps say that the effects of aid are at best small and positive. At worst, aid may have adverse effects. So if we are to try to conclude, we can say that aid research indicate that aid can work for most policy objectives, and that its aggregate effects are positive when measured against the policy objectives aid is designed to support. With one important exception, however. It seemed to be very doubtful that aid can lead to social, institutional, or political change. And I feel that there is a valuable lesson here. These or such policy objectives have in common that they, to a large degree, depend on people changing their mindsets or changing the way they organize and interact. And perhaps that is something that aid cannot change. Ironically, many donors would say that aid is not worthwhile if it does not also lead to such changes. So for the moment, it seems that donors are not willing to learn from evidence, but they still spend a lot of money on purposes where there is most doubt about whether aid can work.